Welcome, everybody. Just going to take another minute to get settled here. Okay, welcome everyone. Can you hear me? Excellent. Excellent. It looks like everyone has arrived. Okay. And as you can see, we have our Caribbean Epistemologies poster shared. Just get a thumbs up from the panelists that still visible. My name is Matt Randolph, and I'm a history PhD candidate here at Stanford University. I'm also the founder of the Caribbean Studies Reading Group. I want to welcome you to the third annual Caribbean Studies Symposium. And I'm welcoming you actually from sunny Santo Domingo here in the Dominican Republic. And I'm a historian of the DR and the African diaspora in the Atlantic world. I'm so grateful that our symposium series has become virtual to allow scholars and audience members from around the world to connect with our Bay Area intellectual community. Our first year theme in 2021 was the Global Caribbean, Resisting Borders of Geography and Identity. Our second year theme was the Queer Caribbean. And today, we are discussing Caribbean epistemologies. We want to commemorate the legacy of Caribbean studies scholar Sylvia Wynter this year. Wynter taught at Stanford from 1977 to 1997 and served as the chair of the program, soon to be department, in African and African American studies. And we want to honor this 50-year legacy of Caribbean thought emerging from our intellectual community. So we're doing Caribbean epistemologies, and we're kicking off with a co-keynote by Leigh Goffe and Eddie Bruce Jones. And there will be a series of 3 virtual panels to follow, starting with Thinking Through Puerto Rico this afternoon, and then Haitian Women's Political Thought and Thinking Through Hispaniola tomorrow. Organized by the graduate student-led Caribbean Studies Reading Group, our symposium series encourages intellectual engagement with the Caribbean region in the West Coast. And we invite scholars from around the world to present their research and ideas to the Stanford community. Our symposium series is hosted by the Caribbean Studies Reading Group, the Division of Literatures, Cultures, and Languages, the Stanford History Department, the Program in African American Studies, the Division of the Stanford Global Studies Law and Literature in the Global South Program, the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society, El Centro Chicano y Latino, which is hosting our viewing party on campus today, and the Stanford Humanities Center. This event is sponsored by the Stanford Humanities Center and made possible by support from an anonymous donor, former fellows, the Mellon Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our graduate organizations include the Caribbean Studies Reading Group, but also Concerning Violence and the Black Studies Collective. I'd also like to shout out my fellow organizers on the Symposium Committee, fellow PhD candidates, Joe Wager from the Iberian and Latin American Cultures Program, Kang Lewis from the Psychology Department, Savi Luis Burgos from the Education Department, and Jessica Feminias, our undergraduate coordinator. If you are not on our Caribbean Studies mailing list already, I will add that link into the Zoom chat later. So without further ado, I want to introduce our moderator for our co-keynote. Dr. Michael Becker is a postdoctoral fellow jointly appointed at the Ruth J. Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice in the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University. His book manuscript and process, Strategies of Survival, Slavery in Jamaica, 1780 to 1834, examines the day-to-day struggles of enslaved Jamaicans to survive, examining struggles to keep families together, secure adequate food, clothing, and shelter, and build community against the brutal backdrop of plantation slavery. He is an assistant editor of the Digital Humanities Project, Slavery, Law, and Power in Early America and the British Empire. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us from Brown, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you to the Caribbean Studies Reading Group and the many co-sponsors. I'm very excited to be moderating this extremely exciting keynote. Mangroves, this Caribbean method in 2 acts, co-delivered by Leigh Goffe and Eddie Bruce Jones. I'd like to say a few things about our illustrious panelists. To begin, Leigh Goffe is an award-winning writer and DJ, specializing in the origin stories that emerge from histories of race, empire, climate, and technology. Dr. Goffe is an assistant professor of literary theory and cultural history at Cornell University. Her story was featured as an experimental short film on Hulu's Initiative 29 that celebrates Black history, heroes, and futurism. Writing recipes, curating exhibitions, and producing mixed media art, she explores the full range of the human sensorium in her artistic practice. She was born in London, United Kingdom, and lives and works in Manhattan. She studied English at Princeton University before earning her PhD from Yale University. Her research is rooted in literature and theories of labor that center Black feminism's engagements with indigeneity and Asian diasporic racial formations. Her co-keynote panelist, Eddie Bruce Jones, is professor of law at SOAS, University of London. He is the author of Race in the Shadow of Law, State Violence in Contemporary Europe, out from Routledge in 2017, and principal investigator of the AHRC-funded project towards an integrated colonial archive, humanities, law, and British indentureship. He serves on the board of directors of the Institute of Race Relations and Rainbow Migration, the advisory board of the Center for Intersectional Justice in Berlin, and the editorial board of the Journal of Immigration, Asylum, and Nationality Law, an advisory board of the European Law Open. He's an essays editor at the literary magazine, The Offing. I'm incredibly excited to present 2 keynote panelists in Mangroves as Caribbean Method in 2 acts. Floor is yours.
Great, thank you for that warm introduction. I'm going to share my screen. And take us on a journey through the mangroves. Act 1. Mangroves are a bridge between the false binary of the land and the sea. After the Black Atlantic and looking to the sea as history, there is a turn towards the geologic that we're seeing in Black studies and feminist theory, towards the shoals and sands that remember, ecologies that disrupt, and more. Seeking the salinity of the saltwater sea, we turn to mangroves and what they interrupt, attenuate, and protect. Sometimes growing to 80 feet tall, they keep more than 50 million people safe worldwide from hurricanes, tsunamis, and flooding. Coastal dwellers live at risk from erosion, and mangroves help with tide attenuation, with the roots acting as storm walls. As we worry about our carbon footprints and the emissions that are ballooning, mangroves have been trapping, fixing, and storing carbon in mud banks for centuries, and they could be part of a future-oriented, nature-based solution for the ongoing climate crisis. These are the questions that I address in After Eden, my book on climate crisis, coming out in 2024 with Doubleday and Hamish Hamilton in the UK. In it, I argue that climate crisis has always been a racial crisis, and those in the Caribbean have known that intimately since 1492. How then, you might be thinking, is race related to mangroves? I look to these and other ecologies in the book as disobedient transatlantic witnesses to colonial conquest, to racial slavery, and to racial indenture. Amerindian temporalities are layered with African temporalities and Indian and Chinese and Middle Eastern cosmologies as climate philosophies, Caribbean epistemologies, if you will. The mangrove is a sacred method for Caribbean studies, and we propose it here in the way that Kamal Brathwaite spoke of contradictory omens. We highlight the saltiness, the vexed poetics of relation, the fragmentation with unity submarine. In 2018, I wrote an article called Guano in Their Destiny about racial sedimentation and the distinct overlapping layers of Caribbean history, as well as South American history, and how race becomes fixed in the bedrock of the Western Hemisphere. Looking to the mutilation of the body and the biomatter that becomes the hemisphere, we see a sequence of blood through racial slavery and racial indenture. And mangroves, as it happens, are an intimate part of the sedimentation process, storing carbon. With their tangled, dense roots, mangroves give us a method to sit with contradictory histories, especially those of racial indenture, which Eddie and I are going to talk about today. A cyclically forgotten event in racial capitalism, we neither seek to resolve nor reconcile the tensions between Black people and Asian people in the Caribbean, but we sit with the question of, when the African diaspora celebrates Emancipation Day, what does it mean that East Indians celebrate Arrival Day? Hinged temporally, freedom rings differently. What of people like us of both African and Asian heritage? This is the question that Eddie Bruce Jones and I are undertaking as part of our NEH HRC grant, of which we are at the midpoint. And when I think back to when we met in 2018 in London, we've long had a commitment to race and the digital humanities, as well as Caribbean studies. And this continues with the grant that will be culminating in 2024, and has also seen different lives within a collective called Dark Laboratory and Afro-Asia Group, of which Eddie is a member of the advisory board. Mangroves chose us, distant relatives connected by these histories, to do this transatlantic work. And both of us recognized the crumbling of endangered archives in the British Library, but we also knew that there were contracts written in Hindi and classical Chinese in Spanish Town and Port of Spain. Bhojpuri, Cantonese, and Hakka languages may have left Eddie and I, but we intimately feel the parchment disintegrating each hurricane season. We consider the humidity and the decay each day that the climate crisis intensifies. So we're honored to be here today virtually and to be invited by Michael and Matt and the Caribbean Studies Reading Group, Stanford Global Studies and History. I'm sure it was a conglomeration and federation of folks who thoughtfully decided on thinking through Puerto Rico, Haitian women's political thought, and thinking through Hispaniola, aptly bookended by a talk with one of my favorite artists that I'm looking forward to, Edouard Duval-Carrier. And it's even more special to know that you all are honoring Haitian Flag Day tomorrow. I also want to note that I'm giving this talk from the unceded territories of Lenape-Hoking and also of the African Burial Ground in New York. Returning to mangroves, they thrive where it's supposed to be impossible for life to take root. Inventing choice out of choicelessness, I echo Toni Morrison's definition of New World Black womanness in Sula. Mangroves adapt and are even said to walk. They transform the ocean into salt crystals, sequestering carbon. And statistics show that from 1980 to 2010, so the span of 30 years, the Caribbean's mangroves have seen a reduction by 1/3. In the next 60 years, it is projected they could disappear altogether. Threatened by deforestation, the wetlands are the target of real estate development. And from the ridge to the reef, trash flows from mountains into gullies and strangles the mangroves, as I've seen in Kingston, Jamaica. They're also threatened by shrimp farming, damming, and tourism. And there is a transnational sacred architecture in that temples are built in mangroves in Kenya. They are disobedient ecologies that form a tropical belt hugging the equator. In India with the Sundarbans, in the Niger Delta, in Indonesia, in Samoa, in Seminole territory, the darker nations, an alignment of the non-aligned, have salt in the wound that is colonialism. And Caribbean studies, as we know, disrupts area studies in a vital way. The density and the thickness of the mangrove and of Caribbean islands defies the primacy of the grid and of colonial time. Mangrove centers are ones of biodiversity, and they provide home and shelter, as we can see in this slide here, for crabs, for sharks, for fish. And when Columbus arrived on Guanahani in 1492, present-day Bahamas, he disrupted this vibrant ecology. He saw the lush green mangroves, as he noted in his journals, and a doctor who was on the boat in October 1492 said, "So thick that a rabbit could scarcely walk through." This was his sense of what the mangroves were like to him. The indigenous peoples, the Lucayan, were forced to give mangroves as a tax of wood, a tribute to the Spanish king, because they were used and valued for charcoal and shipbuilding. So I've learned about mapping mangroves and the rich tradition of Caribbean mapping at the University of West Indies, Mona. And I wrote about the sort of experimentation in DH in an article on mapping the Caribbean in 2019, and what it meant to work with Michelle Thompson-Gums, who's at NYU and of Guyanese and Jamaican heritage, and that her mother was a mapper at UWI Mona. So there's a whole tradition, and I see it in the work of Paris Liu Ai, and also of Ava Maxon, the director of the UWI Mona Center. So when we think about the leftist leaders of the Caribbean in the 1970s who sought extractive economies as solutions, we know that they didn't realize the ruin that was to come. But we can sit with the mangrove and its saltiness as part of a metaphor. But we can also consider tuck and yang and heed that decolonization is not a metaphor. But between land back and oceans back, there's a poetry in the mangrove. And in the humanities, we ought to heed the crisis of our disciplines by talking honestly with scientists, so especially with scientists of color about this peril. And I've had the chance to do that, invited by Black geoscientists to give a keynote in DC last year. And what I learned from them was incredibly exciting. It's led Eddie and I to consider the mangrove as a technological model for computing for the website that we are creating as part of our NEH grant. So we see the biomimetic potential of a decentralized web, of a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization for storytelling within the mangrove. And we're working with Trinidadian developers to explore what the metadata for this might look like. The archival stories we're interested in telling are those that center sexuality, maternal health, fermentation, burial, and these are the stories that are not centered by the British Library and by the colonial archives that we've spent decades of our careers sifting through. We have also seen PhDs in Caribbean studies make video games out of the experience of indenture, and we have to question, what does it mean to simulate that horror? So in the title, being one of two acts, we're clearly making an homage to the ethical questions that Saidiya Hartman presents in Venus in Two Acts. How does one visit the scene of subjection without replicating the violence of grammar? This ought to always be a DH question, for technology is not inherently a savior. Mangrove etymology. Grammatically, the mangrove pushes us to consider the contradictions of being both multiple and singular. And while to the Anglophone ear, it might sound hybrid, man, grove, it is not. It is the survivance of an Amerindian grammar transliterated into Portuguese and into Spanish, mangue and mangle. But what of how to say mangrove in Yoruba, in Hakka, and Bhojpuri? For Black and Asian diasporas, mangroves were not foreign, and they, in fact, were ecologies that they were familiar with. The ecologies of banyans are ones that I've seen in Hong Kong, and they present a kind of web, again, decentralized, that can be thought in terms of mapping and mapping speculative futures. So in summer of 2021, I had the chance to host a cartography summer institute, and Eddie collaborated with me on that to mentor a group of participants named Kristen, Judith, Ryan, Reva, Atif, and Austin. And they actually created a mangrove map under the title of the lands formerly known as South Asia. So through the mangrove map, they showed us a kind of refusal to readily just accept the name South Asia or the term subcontinent grafted onto what we currently know as South Asia. And through this mapping that they gave us, connecting African and Asian diasporas through the mangrove and through percussion, I'm led to consider a mangrove bibliography. They wrote in a manner influenced by Toni Morrison and Sylvia Wynter, and it's exciting to think of a tangled citational practice, tangled like hair, knotted epistemologies that form a woolly genealogy against epistemic violence. So where people see disorganization, we see beauty. Where people see disorganization, we see self-organization. We see West African fractal patterns, braided parts of sacred architectures, of Black, Indigenous urban planning. And in Emma Dabry's book, Twisted, we see these maps formed in plats and rights that was hidden within hair, within braids in Suriname as a way to defy the logic of the violent plot of the plantation that Sylvia Wynter names. Mangroves also defy and deny. They deny pirates and sailors who saw these giant roots snaking down from the sky, standing tall above brackish water, acting as a barrier to the island. Mangles were hiding spaces for plantation runaways, and they formed a territory that defied the extractivism of racial capitalism. When Deleuze and Guattari wrote of the rhizomatic as a nonlinear model for epistemology in 1,000 Plateaus, did they know of the biodiversity of epiphytes, bromeliads, and banyans in the French Caribbean? They wrote convincingly about horizontal and non-hierarchical structures and against the arborescent. But what did they make of Glissant and how he would have understood the mangrove in Martinique? What did they make of Maurice Condé in Guadeloupe and how she published Crossing the Mangrove in 1989? Moving to the present, Steve McQueen, the Black British director, also takes us to the locus of the mangrove as one of descent for the Caribbean diaspora in the United Kingdom. And continuing across the Black diaspora now into the future, Wangechi Mutu gives us Into Canoe, an Afrofuturistic rendering of an entwined interspecies ecology. So to conclude, I want to say that we should heed the uncritical rise of interspecies ecologies as a buzzword that I'm hearing in academia, but also in tech spaces. We should heed the turn to geology that is only concerned with Anthropocenes. I actually reject the Anthropocene as a premise, because as much as there is to gain, there is a lot to lose when we succumb to universalism and its seductive way of weaponizing Caribbean theory. It's common these days to hear Caribbean theorists cited by people who do not know anything about Caribbean history and who don't care to know. They don't understand the sociopolitical reality of the colonial present in the Caribbean, nor do they believe in a sovereign Caribbean future. And this is disturbing because the Caribbean is not something to be mined in terms of epistemology. They cannot see beyond margaritas on the beach, but what work we must ask ourselves is Caribbean theory doing, and what is it called upon to do in a syllabus for a class that is not about the Caribbean? Yes, it should be there, but what does it mean to cite Fanon without understanding that Martinique remains a French département? That, to me, is wretched. I've seen the mangrove in Paris at the Palais de la Porte d'Enée. I've seen it detached in a tank representing the Caribbean. Peoples of the French colonies were on display here too, in this location in 1931 as part of the Paris Exposition. Cut off from life forms and thriving symbiosis, these are the captive specimens of the Antilles that are still endangered and on display in the metropole. From Caroni Swamp in Trinidad, I've seen red ibises swoop down to eat shrimp, and I've also seen incredibly adaptive little baby mangroves in Grenada eking out life in gutters along the street. So considering our shared planetary fate is likely one underwater due to rising sea levels and temperatures, transformative climate justice requires a call and response with the future. And Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley is leading this cry. She has been defiant in amplifying a climate critique of colonialism, and she rejects the premise of the Commonwealth. The debt is theirs, not ours. Europe has dined and dashed and has left us holding the bill, and even has left us to wash the dishes, it seems. Undergoing mangrove transformations, I want to extend the brackish possibility of where freshwater and saltwater meet. The sequestering of Black vitality and temporality, braided plots of rebellion in mangrove thickets. We can learn from these structures how to be adaptive for the climate crisis ahead. We can learn in the shift from celebrating Arrival Day and ships like the Mayflower or the Windrush to actually celebrating survivance. That roots can break waves shows us that climate ruin is not inevitable. Capitalism was not inevitable. There are other worlds, other economies, other ecologies, and cooperative models of decentralized sustainability economically, and they will be needed for climate repair. Mangroves can teach us about irreconcilable differences and the grammar of brackish collectivity beyond the failures of island federation. And we will need them if we hope to avert the full annihilation of the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Tao, and thank you to the organizers of this symposium for hosting us. Thanks to Joseph and to Matt, and also thanks for Michael for moderating. So it's so great to work with you, Tao. I just have to say that from the beginning, you've been so inspiring to helping me think through issues, and I can't believe we've only known each other for a few years. It feels like we've known each other forever, so it's really great to give this talk with you. My part of the talk is related to a reflection that I've been having about my project on internship and related to our joint project on an integrated archive. And the question of ecology, for me, sits in the center of my project, but in maybe a bit more of an abstract way. And as a legal scholar, I'm trying to write a legal history, but I find the critical Black feminist scholarship that is unearthing new ways of even thinking about history. And that becomes the most important literature for this, what would have been a legal, what is still a legal history, but it's really infused with scholarship that I think is guiding it. And so my scholarship is engaged with the question of social and legal histories of indentureship, but I use law, literature, critical scholarship, and I'm using a few leitmotifs that are really guiding my writing. If you could go to the next slide, please, Tal. So I'll start with two epigraphs, and one of them is from Dion Brand, from the map to the door of no return, where she says, "Water is the first thing in my imagination. Over the reaches of the eyes at Goaya, when I was a little girl, I knew that there was still more water, all beginning in water, all ending in water." And the second epigraph is from Toni Morrison in her essay, The Site of Memory, from 1995. She says, "You know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use, but in fact, it is not flooding. It is remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was." So I asked the question, how does water remember? And how do we remember ourselves? My starting point for engaging with the idea of Mangrove as method is water as an element, as a dynamic, and as a counter representation of time and connectedness. My work on indentureship has been involved with sitting in silence in the archives, doing more reading than writing, unfortunately, doing genealogical digging to find detail of the banality of people's lives that were lived adjacent to those of my own kin, walking streets in unfamiliar places that I'd known all my life and familiar ones that I'd never been to. The process has been one of rememory in Toni Morrison, in the Toni Morrison sense, of piecing together bits of past life and finding miraculous points of clarity in the mundane. And so my focus is really on decentering our thinking temporally to extend the potential of a mangrove to decenter our thinking cartographically. And ecology is a term that I think sits in tension with Anthropocene, similar to what Tao mentioned about Anthropocene. I think the totality of our ecosystem and our ecology constitutes human-dominated ways of being. It accommodates human ways of being in its natural variation, but of course has the capacity to both nurture human life and to extinguish it altogether. And this is knowledge gained by the little girl, Dion Brand, sitting and watching the sea. The vast ecology of the living dwarfs humankind. The destructive properties of natural environments are also generative ones. They incite memory, the exquisite myth of endings, of being able to end at all. And they give us humans the nostalgic anticipation of a return, of some sort of emergence, a ghostly ambivalence in our pendulous experience of time. Our death is an anchor in the archive of indenture. It's an organizing facet of the way we imagine the past. We imagine something to have ended, been dismembered, decommissioned, undone in a terminal and irreparable way, and relegated to the post of memory. For some, memory is vague like a spell, but depending on the moment and caught in just the right light, it can be a cutlass. It can be as heavy as death. Death in the archive's pages is also a window into the way we might imagine the temporal architecture of our compulsion to engage with the past lives. This timescape, for those of us living in diaspora, who may have had no way around the malperception, but to reckon constantly with death, is ecosystem. For us, it's not that time. If you could go to the next slide, please, Tao. Writers disrupt the way we experience time. Octavia Butler and Kindred use science fiction to make room for a world where her protagonist, Dana, a Black woman writer of mixed heritage, is brought through linear time to direct physical contact with the violence of her slave-holding great-grandfather, Rufus. She has to survive the antebellum South as an enslaved person, and to ensure her own survival, she must always continually save the life of her white ancestor. Butler conveys here the complexity of time for survivors of intergenerational violence of the plantation economies of enslavement. Dana has no choice but to engage with the brutality of her ancestors, the brutality against her ancestors, and the legacy it left in its wake. Dana, at the start of the book, does not actually possess memories of the past, but rather the past is recomposed in her mind, remembered, and in and on her body as she travels back and forth through time, accumulating the physical and psychic trauma of the upheaval, never mind the blunt savagery of slavery. And when she's in the antebellum South, it is her future that she remembers. And this change, this sweeping back and forth of the pendulum and the perspective that it brings is an important temporal challenge in the historicity of the diaspora community's recollection of the past. So it's a process that diaspora communities go through all the time. In Maharani's Misery, written by Vereen Shepherd, Jamaican historian, uses a narrative account of events captured in archival documents to describe the context in which a woman named Maharani, contracted as an indentured laborer, was sexually assaulted and ultimately died upon a ship called the Allen Shaw, which is pictured here, which sailed from Calcutta to Guyana in the 1880s. Shepherd, in the book, asks questions of the archive relevant to the time she wrote it in the early 2000s, and readers from the 2020s might ask slightly different questions, perhaps, of the archive, given the litany of literature that's emerged on the archive in the past 20 years. But the call to intellectual arms is in any case shouting, imagine what happens if we read between the lines of the archival record and if we narrativize the history of a person who might otherwise remain a scribble in the margin of the archive, if we accept that this history has as its main protagonists the architects of the records themselves. And in her seminal article, Venus in Two Acts, Saidiya Hartman uses what she refers to as critical fabulation to examine the question and upend the material in the archive in an effort to engage more meaningfully with the past than the archive provides language and epistemic foundation and forum for doing. She searches for the remnants of two girls mentioned in the archive's margins, in her words, without committing further violence in my own narration. Hartman not only maps out the problem of reaching into the records and ascribing more violent pasts for the young women she mentions, which itself demonstrates a deep sense of regard for these two girls. But in more recent work, she reconstructs the lives of Black women in the early 20th century American cities as a way to engage with the past that, whilst raising similarly thorny potentials of her interpretive approach, arrive at a crossroads where imagining the beautiful, sometimes terrible, and often banal forms of refusal these women undertake takes precedence over the echoes in the halls of the archive, echoes that are so hollow they often leave no room for ghosts. These forms of engagement with the material of the archive refuse to simply read the words of the archive as a script of history. They imagine details of the lives of people, but they also do something else. They fold time so that the stories are brought into a common vernacular, however discordant they are. If you could go to the next slide, please, Tal. In his 1988 epic poem, Cooley Odyssey, David Dabadine writes, 3 airplanes boarded and many changes of machines and landscapes like reincarnations to bring me to this library of graves, this small clearing of scrub land. The Library of Graves is a space in a patchy brush, a cousin of the archive. It mirrors the space holding the artifacts that turn out not only to be the entry point to any story worth telling, but the only ones that people have access to. Dabadine recounts the double migration of those descendants of laborers who began life in the Caribbean and then continued onwards 1 or 2 generations later, mainly to the UK, Canada, and England, and occasionally to the countries of their heritage. The narrator has traversed the world to find a simple patch of scrubland that holds the dead, a figurative catalog of the past, and the actual material evidence of existence, which for many takes on a particular intimacy among the many forms of deeply knowing oneself. In 1886, a great storm hit the southern coast of Jamaica, and the Rio Minho overran its banks. Maypen Clarendon was underwater. The reporter from the Kingston Gleaner goes into detail, plantation by plantation, to describe what is lost in the flood. Sugar cane, a son, cattle washed out to the sea before they could run, the fence of a pen, and the wall of a house, 2 fine horses. Quote, a coolie was drowned on the estate, and 5 hogsheads of sugar were washed out of the curing house. But most notably was not what was lost and washed away, but who and what was upturned and uncovered. The graveyard at Clarendon Park was flooded out, and dead bodies could be seen floating down the river. 4 coffins were seen, quote, sailing in the cane field. This was the burial ground of East Indian indentured workers, buried and reclaimed by the river, some even by the sea. A half-hour's drive from the heart of this flood and this upturned library of graves is the Jamaican National Archives. The archives relevant for the investigation of British colonial indentureship history are strewn throughout the world in the footprints of exploitative commerce. There are indeed colonial records at London in the UK National Archives and the British Library. However, many of the documents related to correspondence between the East India Company and later incarnations of colonial administrators responsible for indentureship are found in India, at the National Archives in Delhi and the State Archives of West Bengal, and to a lesser extent at the Port Authority collections in Calcutta. These records deal with departures, returns, and large-scale policy shifts, which could be captured in records of corporate governance, unlike the detailed quotidian records of mundane activities, for which many indentured laborers is the evidence of their existence within the system's vast circuitry. The indentures themselves, which detail the status, origin, and next of kin of the indentured, are not found at the central administrative hubs in UK or India, or in the case of Chinese indentured labor in Hong Kong or other parts, but in many countries to which the laborers were sent. These include Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, St. Kitts, etc. The holdings in these repositories taken together, digitized, and preserved would allow for a more detailed overview of where indentured laborers came from, their circumstances, their religious and social backgrounds, and their names, their kin. The materials, though, are largely not digitized, not in the best state, and despite some efforts, still endangered of being lost to decay, accidental damage, and the colonial half-life of the semi-abandoned racial capitalist project. Water is a likely metaphor for the losses precipitated by the machinery of colonialism. If you can go to the next slide, please, Tawa, sorry. No. It expresses the push and pull of history and time, the slippages between our now and our then, and the inability to hold on to the artifacts of the past. It gives us a way to envision the fluidity of the passage of time, its symbolism for the journey, of the movement itself. It must not be overlooked. However, there are other dimensions of water which are useful to consider in the colonial context. There are 3 aspects of water which may be described as their technical faculties that I explored through the leitmotif of the Kalapani, or dark water, a principal motif in the writings of the diaspora of South Asian indentured laborers, descendants of South Asian indentured laborers, which refers back to a Hindu belief that crossing the unknown water irreparably disrupts one's ties to her religious, cultural, and social worlds. In my work, water is a device for encountering, conceptualizing, and theorizing the matter and material of indentureship history. These aspects are flows, precipitation, and refraction. Flows are principally the movement of bodies of water in space, tidal ebbs and flows, and oceans and some rivers, currents, from gentle breeze-driven oscillations to seasonal flows to tsunamis. We might imagine that the water facilitates movement, including transport, and then the personality of water has played a role in the lives of its voyagers and its cargo. When considering this aspect of water as a device, we must remind ourselves that the records of our own histories are not merely that which is floating on the surface. We look for things the water carries laterally and sometimes swallowed, but we must be prepared to consider the water itself. Dion Brand notes Derek Walcott's adage, "The sea is history," and reflects that she had known that through her other everyday knowledge of the sea, growing up as a girl in Trinidad and Tobago. To understand ebbs and flows as merely velocity or energy transfer would misread the totality of the system. Christina Sharp in The Wake describes the radical theoretical work that emerges as a possibility when we consider the conceptual dimensions of the wake, important because of its spatial and conceptual relation to violence. The water is parted by the slice of a ship, a biblical fissure that is once visible and ethereal. It fades but reproduces itself by pushing energy along out into the universe. The same energy that flowed through the motor of the boat, through the burning of the oil or coal, the harvest of things by hand. There's a cycle of human energy invested in the movement of water, its ebbs and flows, its directionality, and damming, of course, its viscosity. And that energy is dwarfed by the totality of ecology, just as human compulsion to order time is swallowed by the ghostly resonances of the past in the present. I want to suggest, in parallel logic to Sharp's important contribution, that we might consider the water itself, the constitution of it, its character, as an instructive corollary to the relationship between history, violence, diaspora, and colonialism. This must be taken in constant co-interpretation with the second and third aspects of water. If you go to the next slide, please, Tao. Precipitation, by contrast, is a cycle that involves the change of state of water into gaseous and solid forms, the traveling of water in a dispersed, diffuse, and generally invisible form, the capacity for water to remain frozen in time or lose itself to time. Ice is frozen and remembers the past in great detail. Robert McFarlane writes that ice remembers the chemical composition of air around it from the last ice age. It is this conceptual range of possibilities, the stubborn permanence of glaciers, the dramatic reconstitution of water during a sudden shower, its appearance in different places, in different form, its movement through beings, the constitution of the living, the emulsion of water into air and into our bodies, and its ability to be extracted again from this integrated hybrid state involves us, living no longer and not yet. We precipitate. We also affect the pace and quality of precipitation with the burning of things that we gather from the earth, the scorching of materials, the harvesting of animals, the quickening erosion of our atmosphere for the short-term benefit of human beings. The ice and the water and the rain, in turn, are imbricated in the business of consolidating resources and wealth according to geopolitical and racial orders. And Tao, if you could go to the last slide, please. The third aspect, refraction, raises yet different questions related to the use of water as a device. It makes demands of sensory perception, of discerning the mirroring and obscuring of light and dark, the bending of images through textures of sight, the variation in color that results from the mediation of a lens, the layering of modes of interpreting that presets our time and space. It is the distress on the mirror, the many siblings of only children, the appearance of a dead relative, and the oneness of steam and frost. Refraction is the presence of many ghosts who inhabit our present. It's the petrichor of diaspora. It blurs the literal and conceptual beyond what might immediately be apparent. These aspects of water are instructive for conceptualizing the archive, but they are not meant to imply a rootlessness or disconnection from land-based geographies. As Tiffany Latabo King notes when presenting her metaphoric framework, The Black Shoals, there's a genealogy of writing about Black diaspora that positions water as a framing metaphor for describing the legacy of slavery due to displacement of enslaved people from lands and the central importance of their journey across the Atlantic. Relatedly, she argues, indigenous communities are frequently described in terms of connections to land, which she contends is a gross simplification. And while her approach to this conceptual oversimplification is to offer the possibility of the shoals, where water and land both play an important part in constituting the material and conceptual terrain of the experiences of both Black and Indigenous communities, my focus on water is from a slightly different point of entry. I'm arguing that the archive and the diasporic subject of indentured labor, including descendants of laborers, can be conceptualized by way of its parallels to water, by its volatility and its ability to carry light and determine weather and its constant change of state. The diasporic communities, including writers, cultural producers, and archivists within it, are as elemental to the archive of indenture as the colonial administrative logs and contract bundles that populate the shelves. After all, in our current global order, one big storm and many of the shelves will be emptied back into the sea. Okay, if we could go to the next slide.
Great. So yeah, we wanted to conclude by just saying a few words about our grant. That is a collaboration between the NEH and the AHRC, so the UKRI, and a bit about the digital humanities. I noted that Matt said co-keynote, and it sounded like Koki, like the frog to me. And I was just thinking about how there's such a soundtrack and a call and response in the Caribbean. So we're thinking really sensorially about this grant and how we can use the digital to expand and amplify. So we're considering virtual reality, extended reality, and just different experimental ways to kind of bring together the grant. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to read from our abstract, Eddie, but maybe you could also speak about how we're looking to hire a PhD research assistant through your new position now at SOAS. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks. Yes, this grant is really meant to be interdisciplinary. I mean, of course, Tao and I are both working within, embedded areas in a certain way, but are working interdisciplinarily in other ways. And a research assistant would really be useful for us. And we're looking for someone to help us on this project for the remainder of this year and part of the beginning of next year. So we can circulate a link in maybe next week with details about that. And yeah, the only thing I would add is that the experience of doing archival work presently really creates the need to figure out what a different archive would look like. And of course, archive in an academic sense can mean lots of things, but we were thinking about material that we have to work with that we can all kind of share in a way. Being able to be creative about how that material is organized and what it means to engage with an archive materially, that I think really needs to be opened up to the same, level of imaginative force that is being used to re-envision how we think about history. So in some way, there's no sense in only theorizing the change that can be brought to interpretation, but also the change that could be brought to the materiality of what we're, what tools we have and what we're using. So
exactly. There's this Derrida quote about the Constitution and interpretation of the colonial archive and how political power is derived from there. So, we are really just wanting to listen, to hear, to feel the texture of this and to engage with folks in the Caribbean to build this. So yeah, we're just excited for it to be collaborative. It'll be debuting in 2024. So stay tuned for the Mangrove that we're going to create. And the thing is, it's going to be nonlinear, of course, because our temporalities are nonlinear in the Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you. very much to our two distinguished keynote panelists. Please join me in giving them a virtual round of applause. Thank you both so much. As moderator, I'm going to take the prerogative to ask a question or two myself before we transition to a more open Q&A. I will just say as we get started, feel free to put your questions into the Q&A spot at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will call on people in the order that their questions are received. The rest of our team will make it so that you can ask your question out loud with the video on if you prefer, or I can read your question to the panelists if you prefer. With that said, thank you so much for such an engaging and provocative presentation. There's so many things that I love to ask, but I'll start with one. I was really intrigued by both of your thoughts about a mangrove temporality, and particularly what thinking through temporality with lens of the mangrove might offer for critical Caribbean studies. And I wonder if you could say a bit more on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, I can begin and then we can kind of bounce back and forth on it because I'm sure we have similar views based on cosmologies of the Caribbean. But for the Summer Institute that I mentioned with the speculative atlas that I made with 31 other people, the frame was Nirvana and Samsara for the group that was looking at South Asian geographies. And I've always been taken by this kind of cyclic idea or temporality of reincarnation in Hinduism. And of course, thinking about how Buddhism, evolves from Hinduism. If we consider that India now is the most populous country in the world, the majority of the world is ordered by such temporalities that center rebirth. But on the other side of that is samsara, right? So being kind of caught in this cycle as opposed to transcending beyond it. So to combine these ways of thinking through the mangrove to Nigeria, so to the Niger Delta, to that river space, we can kind of sit with Yoruba temporalities and also Yoruba historiography. So in a lot of my research, I'm pushing against the kind of idea that there is one historiography and really pushing against colonial historiography and its erasure, certainly of Asian presence in the Caribbean, but also of Amerindian survivance and futurity. So time for us is really, I guess, knotted and entangled in the mangrove in ways that really give us hope, but they're also, more appropriate to probably how people in our families and cultures see time as opposed to GMT, Greenwich Mean Time.
Yeah, a lot of that resonates with me. I'll give it a bit also of some of why I think is important for thinking through these questions in law and social science, because that's also part of what I'm working with. It's interesting looking at legal history as though the most important aspect of that is the way that the law is developed and using that as the center, and then figuring out, what caused this law to be changed to be that, or what congressional debate or administrative debate led to a decision to have an indentureship system rather than not. And I mean, that type of historiography is possible as, one way to think about law, but that is, I think, an impoverished way of thinking about what law means in society, especially when we're talking about a system that was, it's difficult to conceive how people understood the system when they were embroiled in it. So it's not easy to formulate a very clear legal logic of what consent meant, for people who were being conscribed, or what pressures existed for there to be, various levels of, for example, South Asians who were conscribing people to be indentured, because the colonial system was a completely different social environment. So that sounds basic because, of course, it wasn't in our time. So we're thinking of, what was like in the 1800s. But at the same time, it's very tricky to expect a legal history to simply account for that and move on. So part of that meant reading, literature, reading literature from, literature about the era from both South Asian and Caribbean writers who were trying to get a sense of what lived reality was like for people, as a way to bridge an imaginative gap, I think, exists within, conventional types of legal history. So that, it really means trying to figure out where law and literature has a role to play in telling the legal story, which really does bring the past into the present. So you really can't, you can't ignore the types of questions around, around people's experience being very central to a legal history. Whereas a lot of times when I'm writing something that's historical, or I'm even saying something out loud that sounds speculative, you still get, even from, people who you think are critical, this question of why do you have to imagine, why do you have to jump to conclusions, why do you have to write things in history that aren't there? And it does, for me, come back sometimes to this question. It's like, okay, are you engaged with all of the different levels of what it means to be within these diaspora communities and to be asking all of those questions at the same time? Because if not, then you might not see the need for asking the question of experience, or asking the question of descendancy, or why is genealogy important in a legal history? So those types of things, I think, are really key to keeping law and social science on board with a project that's really speaking truth to people's experiences.
Thank you both so much. As a reminder, folks, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A section below. In the meantime, I was really struck, Tal, by a comment you made earlier in your portion of the presentation. I think you were quoting or paraphrasing one of Columbus's men talking about the density of mangroves and difficulty for even a rabbit to pass between them. And thinking a bit later, I think in both your presentations, where you gestured to Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation and the difficulties of representing, revisiting moments of violence and trauma without reproducing those violent acts. And I was also connecting that, with Eddie's gesture of the subterranean. It seems to me that you're gesturing a bit toward what African-American religious studies scholar Charles H. Long would talk about as the ethics of opacity. The idea that maybe there are some things that are not for us to know, or for us to know but not to share in certain venues. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you think about the complex legacies and duties of an interdisciplinary project like yours to contemporary dissenting communities.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I feel that it's one that we're all asking in a meta sense about the disciplines, what is interdisciplinary work today, what's transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. And I want to say congrats to the folks at Stanford on the departmentalization for AFAM, because yeah, when we think about a great thinker like Sylvia Wynter, who is being cited in a way that helps us to traverse the region and the globe, there's a lot to contend with when it comes to the ethics of opacity. So I think in reading her and also in what Glissant writes about opacity, we have a lot of ethical ways to address digital humanities, Eddie and I, because it is not easy work. I think some people have the goal of transparency as if that could ever be achieved, of like, let's digitize the world, let's classify everything. And I heard people at the Natural History Museum in Berlin talking about this goal. It's not even possible in terms of data and data storage, but the question as to like why people want to do this kind of colonial impulse to catalog everything is a death impulse for our people. So when I showed the image of the mangrove in the tank in Paris, that was from a couple of years ago, and it's really just been haunting me ever since. But it also made me realize that, yes, there are people of the Caribbean in Paris, and I'm from the UK, where Eddie is located. So we're all kind of dislocated and transplanted in places where we find strategies of survival. So I'm really excited to hear more about your book, Michael, because the emphasis on strategies, you know, is something that I can hear in where Eddie takes us to in Clarendon, a parish that's really important to both of us. And there's just so many different methods in the mangrove, and crossing the mangrove, as Maurice Condé shows us, is not easy work, but it is also not a problem. I think that people can see it as a problem, like Columbus's doctor on the boat, but it really depends on what your aim is, whether it's a problem or not. In the way that I see it regarding witness, I'm kind of glad if these mangroves were an obstacle to those ships. And I just think about what it is that they witnessed and continue to, because they've been under threat. And I also think of other ecologies like coral reefs that moored ships. I think about, yeah, the mangrove, not as a problem, but as, yeah, something that is opaque and intended to be so, because it protects us. It protects us from the storm, but it also protected fugitive people, Maroons, and other people who were escaping and refusing the plantation to be safe. So yeah, there's just a lot that is very exciting for us in this. And I feel like we're just glad that you invited us to give this talk, because now we have to co-author an article, right, Eddie?
Yeah.
Out of this.
Yeah. I mean, there's just, it seems like there's a sense where I feel like sometimes it's asking all the questions at once, because as academics, we're also in a position where we have to protect our own intentions with our own work, because either there'll be either there's that whole thing where you find that a museum now wants to come in and like do all the digitization and then own all the rights or whatever, or you get a criticism that because the work is so intimate. And I think this is where there's, I think a lot of women scholars of color, and certainly Caribbean women scholars of color are doing such cutting edge innovative work that then gets put into some sort of box like, okay, it's intimate, so it must be just me search or something, you know. And but it reminds me of the it seemed the most urgent question in the world when I heard it, which was basically we were at a presentation of Catherine Hall's project at UCL in London, where, you know, and I think the project does a lot of really interesting uncovering of things that need to be uncovered, and, you know, there's politics around it, whatever, but it's basically tracking the money trail, and how we look at legacies of British slavery in terms of you know, accumulated wealth and land. And someone from the audience though asked, so and this was a question to academia generally, you know, we're tracking money, but I can't find people. I can't find the people that I lost. I can't find relatives. I can't find ancestors. And where's the money to help us do that work? And I thought it was just a poignant question because it was coming from, you know, a young Black academic in our faculty who was floored at the amount of research funds that go to asking questions that don't help her answer an important research question. So it's not just a personal question. It is also a research question. And I think that's something that I struggle with, because I've just realized that, you know, to create the best work, it needs to be informed by all of the dimensions of knowledge, including experiential knowledge. And I think that's what a lot of Black feminist writers, a lot of Caribbean writers and intellectuals have also shown. It's just a matter of being able to take that forward in a profession where you do have to fight tooth and nail to do it.
Thank you so much. We've received a question from the group, the Q&A function. Lucia, would you like to ask this live? Okay, I will start reading it. Lucia asks, thank you so much for this rich and generative and collaborative keynote. As we think with mangrove temporalities and networks, I'd love to hear whether caste features in your engagement with Caribbean epistemologies and diaspora intimacies and frictions. Alongside race, it's increasingly being recognized as a key vector to think through indenture and Caribbean double diasporic experience, adding one more tangled branch to the gloriously unruly mangrove network, especially when we think of Afro, Indo-Chinese, and other Caribbean diasporas in the US, UK, and Canada. Thanks again.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I can begin, but I'm sure Eddie will have more to say, especially from a legal perspective. So I've been reading Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, and while I don't like it, I do like the beginning because she begins with permafrost that is melting and the kind of toxins that are awakened after 40 years. And just even more toxicity in the atmosphere. So that's been giving me a way to think through climate, but also just like the mistranslation of caste from the Indian context into other spaces. I'm sure caste will be very important to us as we understand it, overlapping with the British colonial regimentation of administrators. And what Eddie is emphasizing with the Kalapani is definitely poignant when we consider this question of losing caste when you cross over a body of water, but also the question of pollution being one that really needs to be interrogated, right? And yeah, I think this is going to be really exciting to grapple with using the theorization of coolitude and Kal Turabuli, who has new work coming out that's actually bringing together Chinese and Indian indenture. So we want to embrace the heterogeneity of these experiences, as well as those who were non-Hindu. So those who are Muslim, others who, were Christian or found other ways beyond caste to have these survival strategies. And yeah, this really lends itself to a place like Kenya, where we see a similar kind of British colonial design when it comes to caste and segregation, but also to thinking about the labors and the kind of indigenous skill and artisanal craft practices of certain castes. So this is something we hope to hold within the project as we emphasize knowledge, and that these people, especially from Uttar Pradesh, were cultivators, right? That they were agricultural workers and laborers who found themselves in this brutal institution.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also it's an amazing question. It's a question that raises one of the dissatisfactions with the state of the archive in terms of the indentures, because the indentures give another dimension of what we might know about certain families and certain people who were then brought to work on the same plantations, where then people met one another. There were groups of people who were then for generations together in the same place. And depending on where people arrived, there were different rates of conversion of religion, different rates of people kind of changing their identity, not only to simply, an Anglo-Christianized identity in Jamaica, for example, but changing one's own history in terms of the narrative of where people came from and what they did for a living and that sort of thing, or learning, Bhojpuri if they didn't speak Bhojpuri before. So there's a lot of room to kind of do some research around what to get closer to kind of an idea of what people declared as their identities when they were signing up, which we also know is has multiple levels of negotiation. But then in returns, so people who were brought to South Asians who arrived in a lot of places to which they were indentured, returned at different rates depending on their social status, including their caste backgrounds. So those from traditionally lower castes were they were less likely, and of course this can't be studied reliably, but less likely to return given the types of resources and the types of connections that one would have had when returning. So there were lots of things that distinguished people's experience along the lines of caste. And then, of course, caste and religion are conflated and overlap in various ways. And there were different laws that applied to people of different religions, depending on where you were and what the period of time. So laws around marriage and that sort of thing. And then to complicate things even more, there was this concept of the coolie. And yeah, Kyle Turabali has done some amazing work on thinking about this concept of coolitude just generally, but then caste and labor and this concept of the coolie are also overlapping in ways that make it challenging to kind of tell a singular story. But of course, that's not what we're looking for anyway. But it's just to say it's just interwoven into every aspect of the experience of indenture.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just draw your attention to the question in the chat or comment. Cynthia writes, Tao, as a Trinidadian Hindu academic working in the area of law and society, I agree with your response to Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste. It looks like we also have a question from Black Discourse. Thank you both for a rich conversation. Thinking about Glissant's study of the rhizome and diasporic consciousness, do you see the sacred architecture of the mangrove also as tool, resource, or guides for the larger Caribbean diaspora to learn, relearn, and remember belonging/home?
Yeah, I'll answer quickly and then pass it over to Eddie, because we're deeply informed by a certain constellation of thinkers, clearly. And our hope is that the Mangrove can become a digital tool for those purposes, as expressed in the question. And we hope that it's one that is loud and participatory, that it has a kind of interactive or dynamic feature. Whether our technological skills will be enough to realize that dream will be exciting to see in the next year. But the concept of retour, or the return, is really deeply important to us. Eddie has this beautiful poem that I always quote, and I saw him give a reading at the Migration Museum in London, that India has left us. So in my talk, I spoke about how Bhojpuri may have left us. And I don't know, maybe Eddie does speak it, but Hakka has left me, Cantonese. And I think the question of our mother tongues is an important way in to thinking through what Glissant is telling us with that return, with the retour, but also in the detour, right? So a kind of detour in the way that Stuart Hall reads it, to fashion identity as an ongoing process in the present. So a detour through a historical moment, through a fragment from the colonial archive, can be a way to find ourselves in the mutual coordinates of diaspora, because those coordinates for me and Eddie are New Jersey. They're also New York. They're all of these different parts of the metropole that we've found ourselves in at different moments. And Glissant understood that well, so did Stuart Hall, as an ongoing recursive process. So we think that the digital tools, the decentralized web idea, could be one that is rhizomatic, building kind of beyond the Guattari model of the rhizome, and more so emphasizing a Martinican way of seeing it.
Yeah, and just to add, I don't think it's, I mean, I try not to romanticize the idea of being both in, lots of different places and not feeling completely settled in one place. But I think that is just such a shared experience among lots of people who are thinking about diaspora in similar ways and moving around in order to place themselves in a place where they're able to do that kind of work. It makes it so kind of visceral to kind of feel like you're a part of a system where there's something unseen that, call it opacity or subterranean or something. They all kind of fit the metaphor of the rhizome. And I think that this tool is, it's one of the great things of the digital era, that there can be this thing that I know Tao mentioned, is kind of decentralized form of communication. And I do think that it's a way to think about critical Caribbean studies, because it might, it's probably not the experience of every diaspora. I think there's something that has led the types of questions around violence and around forced displacement, and the whole idea of, in India having left us, and language being something that kind of language not having access to language hasn't been a pure coincidence or passage of time. It's been about adapting to the violence of colonialism and survival and that sort of thing. And so there is a specificity around the types of diasporic questions that we might ask of the Caribbean. So it's, it's at the same time in conversation with Césaire that we see with, Kyle Turabuli's work, that we see in the Black diaspora in other ways beyond the Caribbean. So there are these rhizomatic, different rhizomatic projects that are happening that we can draw from.
Black Discourse, do you want to ask a follow-up? Couldn't tell. Okay, okay.
Thank you.
They just say thank you very much. Well, thank you both for an extremely engaging and amazing keynote. I'm afraid we are at time. So I'd just like to thank you again very much for joining us virtually at Stanford's Caribbean Studies Symposium. And thank you all in the audience for joining us. Please remember there's a wealth of other wonderful panels going on through the rest of this week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
You.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Tao. Hello, everyone. We will stay online. This is the same Zoom link for the entire symposium. And we will play some intermittent music and yeah, we'll just be available in between the panels. Thank you, everyone, for attending.